right? But we can make it work. This is why we have technology. Thank you for clicking on this video. I hope you're having a phenomenal day, week, weekend, whenever it is you're watching this. I hope you're doing well. As you could guess from the title of the video, I want to do a comparison between Sony and Blackmagic cameras. My personal experience having used both of them, and hopefully it sheds some light on pros and cons between both. Right now there's like a huge crazy sale going on for the Blackmagic full frame 6K camera. Whatever stage you're at, hopefully this helps with your decision making process. Just to sort of set the scene a little bit, so I'm a solo videographer, video production person. I pretty much do everything myself. So as a one-man band, as I'm sure a lot of you watching this can relate, you have to have gear that really works for you and is really easy to manage, doesn't take a lot of brain power. First things first, this Blackmagic camera actually doesn't work right now. If you leave the battery in there, there was a known issue where it was shorting out the screens and rendering them pretty much useless. Like, there's only parts of the touchscreen that work. I can't really change any settings. I need to get this thing repaired. Long story short, that's my first con in the category of this. But now let me get into like some actual scenarios or use cases that I found myself really regretting using this camera. I mostly shoot run and gun type documentary stuff for a nonprofit that I work with. So just going to events for them, capturing the things they're doing, making like recap edits. This is definitely not the camera for that kind of thing. Unless you're really scripting things out, or this is part of a much larger project and shooting this raw footage would really, really help sell the production value of the project. It doesn't honestly make a lot of sense to shoot everything, definitely not at 6K resolution, but also the biggest drawback, in my case, no autofocus. So autofocus, it turns out, is something really nice to have when you're just shooting run and gun, when you're by yourself, when things are constantly moving. You know, you need a zoom lens to be able to capture everything. Like, it's very documentary feeling. While, you know, you can get by with manual focus and it's not really the end of the world, it definitely sucks when you're used to having autofocus on, say, just a digital mirrorless SLR camera or something. So yeah, having no autofocus, and these are just things that I didn't really like take into account. Like, I had to actually go through and experience it to know for sure that it wouldn't work for me. That was kind of the first con. And so for advice, you know, I would say definitely consider that. This is not a super ideal camera for run and gun stuff for that reason. If you rely on autofocus, or if that's something that you think it would be kind of a pain to do without, definitely consider that. For any of the Blackmagic cameras, they're meant to be cinema cameras, just like, you know, an ARRI Alexa wouldn't have autofocus built in. They're meant to be operated, meant is kind of a strong word, but they're meant to be operated with multiple people, or at least meant to be operated with the assumption that you're either shooting locked off shots, or you have this all rigged out with some sort of focus system or something. It didn't really perform the best on a gimbal. I found myself getting exhausted pretty easily. I didn't have a really proper halo rig to distribute the weight really well. And again, I'm also just kind of a beginner at that point, at least. Beginner solo creator. Maybe I had help from a friend or two here or there for projects, but for the most part, just without having a ton of experience, a ton of equipment to be able to operate these things the way they're meant to be operated, it can be really tough to get over some of those hurdles, and really cumbersome, and sometimes just a lot more pain than it's worth. The other huge con is battery life. So battery life is absolutely atrocious on these, as you know, that's old news at this point. So you really do have to rely on some sort of external power source, or just a V-mount battery system, and rigging this out. And again, once you do that, at that point it's just a huge bulky cinema camera rig, and if it doesn't have autofocus, you're doing that too. So it turned out that it was just making less and less sense for me for the type of work I was doing, which was a lot of run and gun, a lot of running around. And also when it comes to the Blackmagic cameras, I mean, you got to kind of consider some of these accessories that go with it, that, you know, while you can't use the camera right out the gate, you know, it can be really helpful to have a cage to be able to mount your hard drive to, which is a whole other thing. Like, trying to record with like the Type B or whatever type memory systems, the CF Express cards, I think is what these cameras use. You're gonna have some limitations. If you're trying to shoot at the absolute highest frame rate, you really would be better off getting a rugged or just a Samsung T7 solid state drive to record to. That's what I use for a lot of the time. So the total ticket price for the whole build actually back when this was like $2,000, I think when it first came out, the total amount I paid for the entire kit was closer to $3,000 by the time I got everything on there. So there's that to consider too. Now, since I've done a good amount of shitting on this camera, let me talk about some of the pros. For one, you know, it does shoot 6K. So, I mean, that's just something that it's gonna have over any other competition in that price range that you're just not gonna get. Although, of course, as we all know, there's not really any reason to have a 6K quality image on screen a lot of the time, you know, as your final output source. But of course, what that means is that you can crop in on your image and maintain a lot of resolution. You have these master files that are just enormous and you can do a lot with them. They're very versatile. And, you know, it's just gonna make the image look just ever so slightly better than everyone else's. So there's that. The other thing, of course, huge pro of these cameras is the space where I got the most use out of them by far was filming interviews. That is what these cameras, I feel like, are meant to do. I really can't stress enough how great these cameras perform locked off. Here's some footage of some interviews that I shot with these, and I had a friend who also had one, so I was fortunate enough to be able to do a 2-camera setup with 2 Blackmagic 6K cameras for a lot of these interviews, and I was just so blown away with the image quality. And the best part is you can just plug them into power and forget about them, or bring a V-mount battery and lock it off. And with a V-mount battery filming at 6K, I mean, these will last for hours. So you really don't have to worry about battery life when it's locked off on a tripod. The reason that I'm considering one of these cameras would be for this, actually, for as a studio camera, like just a locked off studio camera that stays here, film all my interviews with it, film all my sit-down videos with it. For the price point, I mean, it just films such great quality and it has all of the bells and whistles I could need, and I don't have to worry about packing it up, bringing it, short battery life, like all of that goes out the window. Yeah, as an interview camera, I can't say enough good things about this line of cameras. Again, I only have experience using this particular one, but I can only imagine that the same goes for all of the cameras within the pocket cinema camera realm from Blackmagic. The customization, the ease of use, the giant 5-inch touchscreen. I mean, there's just so many good things about it as a stationary camera for getting certain shots that you really can't beat, especially again at the price point. I mean, you're getting so many features and so many shooting capabilities, like it's just unreal. The other huge pro is this might only apply to a handful of people who are maybe just now starting to get into it. The other huge pro is that it comes with DaVinci Resolve Studio. So you now have the studio version, the pro version of DaVinci Resolve, $300 value that you just get for free when you buy any of their cameras. So if you didn't have that already, that could be a huge perk, a huge plus to be able to use their software with this. Because the other thing is, and this could be a pro and a con, but this is something that I don't hear a lot of people talking enough about: RAW, shooting in RAW. This is something that really depends on what level you're at, I would say. Of course, all the people who are very, very well versed, you know, they're way beyond me skill and experience wise with cameras and video production, filmmaking, whatever. RAW isn't really a big deal. If anything, it's like, okay, yeah, it's pretty much necessary. Like I gotta shoot everything that's client work in RAW. For somebody who's either at a level like I'm at or just starting out, it's one of those things that's like great power, great responsibility, right? Like shooting RAW is a great thing to have to be able to get the most detail out of your shots as possible and to get the most dynamic range and be able to shoot outside and still capture stuff in daylight and shadows and all those things that RAW comes with. But you have to know what you're doing in post-production, or you have to know somebody that does. Otherwise, your images will come out looking like this and just not really be that appealing. It's a lot of responsibility. So, you know, as awesome as a feature as that is, you really have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, the image is not gonna come out looking as good as it possibly could. Once you start shooting in Blackmagic RAW, which is native to DaVinci Resolve, you can actually go in manually after the fact and change your ISO settings. You can change your white balance settings in post. If you accidentally set your camera to daylight, for example, and you're shooting somewhere that's really warm and your color is like way too orange, you can actually go in to the software and just adjust your color balance. And I don't mean adjusting the slider to make it more blue. I mean like actually adjusting the file itself of like what white balance it was shot at. If you're shooting in Blackmagic RAW, it gives you that capability. For future-proofing yourself, maybe that makes a lot of sense, right? You're like, okay, well, maybe I don't have the skills to necessarily handle all of this right now, but it's something I could learn, something that I could use to help grow myself. And that's certainly what I did. Like, I shot all of those interviews in RAW, and I just basically had to dive in and figure it out. Yeah, great power, great responsibility. But that is something to consider with these cameras, is you get a ton of features, but you really have to know what you're doing to be able to make them work for you. The other thing you can say for longevity is just what types of shooting can it do. And the fact is the Blackmagic just has way more options in terms of what it can shoot for the price point. It is probably going to be something that can outlast or just outperform a lot of the Sony cameras at that same price point as far as variety of shooting modes. Another thing I'll point out is I've used an array of Sony FX3s for shooting a live concert that I did. The one thing though that I would slightly give an edge to Blackmagic for is I actually, for that shoot, I had all of the cameras going into transmitters and all of those transmitters going into an ATEM mini switcher board. That was great and it worked well, but Blackmagic I know has a lot of extra built-in features if you use their cameras to do that same thing. A lot of features that I didn't get because I was doing this whole thing with Sony cameras instead of Blackmagic cameras. So if you're confident you can find clients that would be interested in doing multicam productions, I think Blackmagic does have the edge there. They just have a whole array of like integrated systems of things to do multicam type shoots, and you don't even have to buy all of the cameras. I mean, you could just have one and just rent the cameras and the gear you need on an as needed basis. And that might be very specialty, that might not be very common for a lot of people, but if that is something that you might be doing, I would give the edge to Blackmagic in that regard. So now let's get into the FX30 and talk about why I'm leaning a lot more towards this camera for a lot of my different stuff. For one, like we already talked about, the autofocus. I mean, it's just, especially Sony's autofocus, now it's gotten so good, especially when you match it with a good native Sony lens. I mean, it just makes a lot of sense, right? And I already had a few Sony lenses, so getting the FX30 just made a lot of sense. And other than this Blackmagic camera, I'd never had a camera that could shoot 10-bit footage, so I was like, okay, this camera is not going to work out for me for what I need most of the time. So I need something that can still get me a really great looking image, but not break the bank. And that's where the FX30 came in. I would say above all the other things compared to Blackmagic cameras is just the nimbleness of this FX30, of this Sony camera. Like, I cannot stress enough how much value personally I put into ease of use, nimbleness. This has an articulating touchscreen, unlike the Blackmagic cameras, which, you know, the new ones at least tilt out, which is better than nothing, which is another huge downside of this camera, like having to look at it dead on. Kind of a pain. And I would throw a monitor on there sometimes, but that just added to the weight and I was not about that. So with this camera, not having to add a monitor if I don't want it because I have a screen that can articulate, not having to worry about autofocus and not having to worry about battery life either, like all of those things together just made this camera make so much sense for me. The other thing I would say is this camera performs great on a gimbal, and I've actually used this camera on a gimbal with prime cinema lenses. So with an autofocus system, you know, it's small enough, compact enough. I didn't really need to use a second monitor. I could just use the screen and tilt it and adjust it depending on where we were holding it. The other great thing about these cameras is it has live streaming built into it, so somebody else can monitor and actually even control the camera and change the settings from an iPad or from their phone, which was super helpful. But like transmitter receiver combos from Teradek or anything like that, I've never really bothered with that for this camera. The final things I can say as far as advice, at the end of the day, like, you know, it's almost a cliche at this point, but the best camera really is the one that you have and the one that you have access to, and you can really make any camera work in any situation if you are creative enough, or if you're disciplined enough, or if you're talented or willing enough. If there's a will, there's a way, right? So although, you know, some of these things were slight annoyances or slight, you know, setback, there was never a time where like a camera just absolutely could not do the job that I needed it to. And honestly, need is even a strong word. I mean, depending on the client, of course, depending on who you're working with, if you're just starting out, most likely you're not relying on a huge corporate job where there's a ton of crew and a ton of this and a ton of that, where like a gigantic budget where they're absolutely depending on the image looking a very specific way. Most likely you're not working on that when you're starting out anyways, those types of jobs yet. So really any camera you get gonna set you at least above, you know, the person who just has like, say, a Canon Rebel camera or something like that, and it's gonna produce a pretty darn good image quality regardless of the shooting scenario. Either of these cameras are gonna do the job. Here's, I think, the thing that might be the most helpful, and of course there's probably some exceptions to this, but what I would say is just a general rule: if you're gonna film more run and gun stuff, I would lean towards the edge of the Sony line of cameras. And if you're gonna film more sit down stuff like this, like if you're gonna be a YouTube content creator where you're doing a lot of sit down stuff like this, if you're gonna be doing a lot of interviews or locked off sort of shots or shooting, then I would say you could probably get away with a Blackmagic camera. Even if you're not necessarily getting paid for it yet, if you're considering or desiring to do photography as well as video, then I would say it's kind of a no-brainer. You really want to lean towards the hybrid set of mirrorless cameras from Sony. And again, I'm not gonna bring Canon into this. If you know people that use Canon or you've used Canon and you like Canon, there's other videos out there that can help you with that. Specifically, I'm just talking about my experience between using Sony and Blackmagic cameras. If you're wanting to pursue photography though, and you're trying to decide between these two sets of cameras, you pretty much, you're going with a Sony camera, a Sony SLR mirrorless camera. So the only other thing that I would throw out there is that I don't really hear a lot of people saying, but before you make any purchase decisions, try renting the cameras that you're considering. You know, for like only $100 or a couple $100, you could rent these cameras for a few days sometimes, depending on the rental place and depending on the time frame. I know that a lot of these places you can't return or rent things on weekends. So if you rent something on a Friday, you return it on a Monday, they'll only charge you for one day. And also sometimes, I had a friend that did this, if you rent stuff from a rental house, you know, obviously it's gonna be something that's technically used. If you rent it for a few days and you decide you want to keep it, sometimes they'll sell it to you at a discount, a significant discount, because for one, it's used, for one, you've already paid a little bit to rent it, and yeah, you can get stuff for a pretty good deal if you just buy it straight from the rental house after you've used it for a little bit. There's nothing wrong with buying something used that way as well. So I think that about does it. I think that wraps up everything I needed to say. Hopefully something I said in there was helpful to some of you guys. So if you have any questions, please comment below. I'd be happy. I'd love to answer anything or talk to you guys about anything more you want to know. But most importantly, I hope you have fun and enjoy the process of whatever you're pursuing, whatever creative endeavors you're a part of. And I'll talk to you next time.